Hi guys, it is a gloomy day here in upstate New York in the collapse of global industrial civilization, but we're going to go down the coast where it might be a little bit of a gloomy day also to Baltimore, Maryland, where I have the great honor of speaking to a man who kind of stole the career that I wanted years ago, and this is science journalist Erik Vance is going to be speaking with me for a few minutes. If you are not familiar with Erik Vance, that is E-R-I-K Vance, you need to go on to erikvance.com and check out more work from him. Just briefly, Erik is a science writer now based in Baltimore. He graduated with honors from Principia College in Illinois in 1999 with a degree in biology. After working on a number of research projects dealing with dolphin intelligence and coastal ecology, he became in turn an environmental educator and an environmental consultant. But it wasn't until enrolling in UC Santa Cruz's science communication program that he discovered his true passion for journalism. There he learned that only through compelling characters can stories touch and inspire us. As such, he has modeled his career around science-based profiles of inspiring, dedicated, or controversial figures in society. He has appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Nature, the New York Times, the Utne Reader, Discover Magazine, the Christian Science Monitor, most recently the Washington Post, and he is currently under contract with Harper's Magazine and National Geographic. And with all of that, Erik Vance, I really appreciate you finding a few minutes in your busy schedule to come talk to us at Collapse Chronicles. So say hello to the folks and we'll just dive right into it.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, well, obviously, Erik, with a name like Collapse Chronicles, what I'm going to want to be talking to you about today is probably what it seems to me is your number one collapse of interest in your writing, and this is the collapse of the oceans. And so I'm pretty much just going to throw it open and let you start talking, and when I want something with some further elaboration, I will try to break in every now and then. So Erik Vance, just look into your crystal ball with what you have learned in the first 18 years of the 21st century. Look ahead to 2050 and give us your vision of what the world's oceans are going to look like in the year 2050, and spell it out why you think that way, and is there anything we can do about it at this point? Is that enough for you to dive into with?
Sure, I can give it a shot.
Go for it.
2050. I mean, obviously there have been studies that have indicated that by that date, more than half of the ocean populations will be, in some sort of endangered status, and which would vastly change what we eat. So I guess there's two ways to look at, and think about the ocean, and I do write about a lot of other topics other than just the ocean, but I have spent a lot of time getting underwater. I guess there's two ways to look at the ocean, right? There's what we're going to see when we go swimming, and there's what we're going to see on our dinner plates. And what's interesting is throughout history that actually the fashions for what we eat often change based on what's underwater. So years ago people ate a lot of swordfish and a lot of sort of herring and smaller fish that were very easy to get, and they became very fashionable. And when those populations collapsed, things like salmon and shrimp and lobster became more fashionable. And then as different species collapse, you start, orange roughy becomes a thing. And then, when was the last time you saw orange roughy on a menu? And a lot of these things are actually tied, they're tied to things that happen in the ocean. We just don't really realize. You don't really notice it when orange roughy sort of falls off a menu, or Chilean sea bass is maybe harder to find, and now there's more halibut on the menu. So, what are the oceans going to look like? Honestly, a lot of it depends on China. There's been a lot of changes in China around these sort of fads of what people eat, and our fads in the United States have had a huge impact on things like cod, or sardines. These things have fluctuated enormously based on American appetites. Well, China historically has eaten freshwater carp and different freshwater sort of aquaculture species, and tastes are shifting there a little bit more towards wild-caught ocean species. What we've been eating, kind of all along. And if that happens in a large way, we're going to see a very, very different ocean. And basically, I guess the short way to say it is, if China starts to behave like the United States has for decades, they're not going to be any fish left. I mean, it's just the ocean can't support that. The ocean can't support the United States' appetite, let alone China and the United States. So that's, when you're looking ahead, that's really the big unknown is, and already, most of the consumption of fish in China, and actually most of the consumption of fish in the world, is freshwater fish in China. That's still what, there's just so much freshwater. Yeah, when you look at fish protein eaten across the world, most of it is freshwater fish eaten in China. And if you look at China, obviously most people there eat some form of freshwater fish, usually aquaculture. So that's sort of and it's really hard to know how that's going to change. I think as that changes, and there's actually some really interesting programs in China to try to do that more sustainably, as they shift into ocean fishing to try to do that more sustainably. There's already Chinese boats around the world sort of copying the American slash and burn, take whatever you can get, have 80% bycatch and hope everything turns out okay kind of style of fishing, which is not going to work. It's not going to work for the United States. It's not going to work for China. It's not going to work for anyone. And so and I think that's what's interesting. What's interesting about ocean collapse is it's people catching and eating a thing that's causing it. And so many problems in our world are secondary issues, climate change. It's hard to wrap your brain around it because it's putting stuff in the ocean, and it's putting stuff in the sky, and it's sort of having other effects. You can't really see it. Pollution is kind of like that.
Let's take these one at a time. Obviously, I hear mostly. Let's just go through the threats. Overfishing. It sounds to me like, if I'm hearing you correctly, would you say that the number one threat, at least to the marine life in the oceans, is direct predation by humans via overfishing, and the collapse of the fisheries due to overfishing is that in itself, without even, we're going to get to all the others.
Yeah. That, I would say, studies, people have looked at these sort of big questions, have pretty universally said yes. Now, will that be the case, in 100 years? I don't know, but we're talking about 2050. Yeah, if the oceans were a person, they'd be worried about overfishing. They wouldn't be worried about climate change when it comes to mass extinctions yet. That's definitely something down the line that's going to affect oceans. And oceans are changing in very troubling ways. But if you want to talk about, collapse in the next 30 years, we're talking about overfishing, I think everyone pretty much agrees on that.
Yeah, it was the documentary End of the Line which I saw about 8 years ago, where I don't eat seafood. Well, maybe towards the end of this, if we have time in the end, we can get back to not eating seafood. So I remember
we should, because there are some alternatives. But let's get to that later.
Yeah, let's get. So I remember, and I think it was saying this big study by the year 2048 that essentially, purely from the overfishing angle, that essentially there would be no more viable fisheries left on planet Earth. Does your research bear that out still?
Oh goodness, I know the study you're talking about. I'm not going to touch it because it's been criticized so much. I think that study was really problematic, but like many studies like that, like a lot of climate change studies, they're trying to look ahead in the future. They're trying to shape, grab these things, and people who criticize it can criticize it, but the ending sentiment is, I think is valid. Like, it's incredibly perilous right now. I think the way they went about that today is sort of like, I just can't stand behind it. But the sentiment is, when you look at the oceans, it is, I spent a lot of time in the Sea of Cortez, which is interesting because that's a place that we've been fishing very heavily for a very long time. It's really near the United States. It was always very accessible, and it has huge biodiversity. And so it's a really great place to look at, where fishing is going. And we as a species were able, and pretty much most of the country, we were able to just wipe out this region of all of the large animals underwater. And basically, some things are coming back, but, we are really good at this. And so, unchecked, I'm really troubled about what my kids and my grandkids are going to see when they go swimming. If they're going to see anything. As it is, I don't. Like, if you have any older listeners who maybe went diving in the 80s, like, I don't get anything like that anymore. I don't even know what that was like. And pretty much anywhere you name.
How old are you now, Eric?
Scuba diving. What's that?
How old are you?
Oh, I'm 40.
40 years old. All
yeah.
Right. The big 4-0. See, so you're 18 years younger than me, so I probably have a different baseline, because I remember going skin diving off of Belize and along there in 1974. And I am quite sure if I went back there now, it would look nothing like it did in 1974. And,
No, I think the easy way to sum it up would be everything's smaller, and a really good day-to-day would be moderate to lousy day back then. Like, that's, I think, and in a lot of places, especially accessible to average people, Cancun, places where you can, without going to some tiny island in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. So that's what you're talking about. You're talking about basically the best day-to-day being only okay 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, the Sea of Cortez, would you characterize that kind of as the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the oceans?
Yeah, I would. I do, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, we've been, like I said, we've been fishing it a long time. It's in a middle income, sort of developing economy that I think characterizes a lot of the most important countries, that are stewarding their oceans right now. Indonesia and India, a lot of Southeast Asia. These are countries that are sort of, Mexico is one of these countries that it has a lot of developed institutions, but it's not. It doesn't have quite the ability to enforce laws and things that that you see in more developed countries. So I think that's an important aspect of that. But also, the Sea of Cortez has just about every ecosystem you can imagine. There's one coral reef area there. There's shallow sand, deep rocky areas. It gets very warm in one area and very cold in another. And it's like the entire ocean in a microcosm. So you can look at these, and it's got a lot of endemic animals you don't find anywhere else, and they're kind of trapped. And so it's like its own little mini ocean. And you can really ask a lot of really interesting questions and really see where we're going by looking at the Sea of Cortez.
Okay, just before we this is simply because we're 15 minutes into this already. Good Lord! Just real quickly, can you give us your prognosis for the vaquita? What is the vaquita? How many of those little guys are left? And give us your honest opinion on whether the vaquita is going to make it or not.
Yeah, so the vaquita is the world's smallest and rarest marine mammal. It's a small porpoise. If folks know what a harbor porpoise is, it's a little smaller than a harbor porpoise. You know, without throwing out your back, you might be able to carry one. And in fact, one of the scientists could carry a couple of them under his arms. You know, but they're not light. So that's sort of the size, 100 pounds or so. A very small animal, very mysterious. It lives in the northernmost tip of the Sea of Cortez. And it got sort of trapped there by evolution, and it's probably always had very small numbers up there. And basically, it's the same size as another very valuable fish called the totoaba. The vaquita is not in itself very valuable. The totoaba is very valuable. A kilo of its swim bladder, which is one organ in its body that sort of helps regulate its position in the water, is worth $10,000. So this is a very valuable thing. A lot of poaching, a lot of problems around this. And the vaquita happens to live in the same place, and it's the same size. So it gets caught up in the same nets. And that's basically the downfall of the vaquita, has been its proximity to a very valuable fish.
And this all plays into China.
Yes.
Where these things are going is to China.
Yeah, the totoaba was, for a long time, it was consumed for its meat in the United States and other places. It was delicious meat. And actually in the 70s, when it was first declared endangered, it was probably the United States and other nearby, other developed countries, sort of the market for the meat that really caused that decline. That shifted to this incredible, valuable swim bladders that now they don't even keep the meat. They'll just catch the fish, cut it open, pull the swim bladder out, and leave the carcass. So but it is. It's like one of those products that there's a high demand for in China, and so the value goes through the roof. And I think this is something we're seeing play out in a lot of different spheres, in a lot of different ways. And so the vaquita basically, last time anyone checked, you're talking about maybe 20 animals with high error bars. So I like to say 20 animals plus or minus 40. Really.
So let's get real. Are we going to have vaquitas in 5 more years? Or are they just going to join the depressing list of?
No, I think I don't think. I think any optimism for them continuing on is probably just wishful thinking. They really are gone, and it's really sad because this was an avoidable extinction. It's a big charismatic animal, even though they're very shy. It's an important animal, and it could have been protected, but no, there's no way. The last ditch effort was last year when scientists got together and tried to capture as many of the remaining vaquitas as they could. We didn't know if they would be captured, if they would allow themselves to be captured. Some animals just won't, and it turned out the two that they caught they just didn't do well, died, and they couldn't keep them.
They died.
One died. Yeah, the other one they had to release
before it died. Yeah.
And people will argue about why, but I think no one can argue that they don't do well in captivity. So that's the last. That's the last shot. That's the last thing, and we're doing it more and more. You're seeing the piece I wrote for the Post. You're seeing this more and more across the world. Is these hyper small populations, and we sort of rally the troops and try to save 10 animals. This is happening a lot, and it didn't work this time.
So we can just kiss good as the Requiem for the Vaquitas. One of your recent work.
But we can't kiss them goodbye. I mean, what we need to do is learn from them, because this, we can either let this happen again.
Will we learn from the Vaquita, Eric, or will we not learn anything from the Vaquita and just keep repeating this same dreary story? The more and more humans are in the ocean.
Well, I mean, one of the tragic parts of the Vaquita was that we really made local people the enemy. We made the local fishermen the enemy in that process, and I think you can argue that that may or may not work in the U.S. You have something like spotted owl, that may or may not work, but we know it doesn't work in sort of an emerging market context, because on the ground there's not a lot of enforcement of laws, and if the people aren't on your side, if they don't see a value to this creature, they're not going to protect it, and they're the ones who kind of get to decide. I mean, you're talking about a species that goes extinct because of no more than a population of 50,000 people, a couple little towns, and they decide the future of that species, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
So there are some lessons to be learned, and there are some cases kind of like the Vaquita where the animal was saved because of local engagement, because of smarter conservation. So I think there are some lessons to be learned. I think you can't just walk away and say, well, Vaquitas are gone and we're going to... I cry about it, but I think other people shouldn't. I mean, you should look at this and say, okay, what did we really do wrong? And one of the big things was pissing off the locals. And people complained about the locals and how they were corrupt and this, but it doesn't matter. They're the ones who are going to decide. And we need to accept that and figure out how to do development, often economic development, so that they value the resource that we find important. That's the way it's got to go. And there are ways to do it, but we missed our chance with Vaquita.
Yeah. Okay, I could go right on with this angle of this conversation for the balance of this conversation, but I want to get into some other things, and the main other threats that I think most people understand that I want to talk about. I mean, this is only going to give us like 6 or 7 minutes per. Is ocean acidification from climate change, coral reef bleaching from climate change, plastic pollution, and the newest one on the horizon, deep sea mining. So where is your feeling about ocean acidification? How is that going to play out between now and 2050 as a threat to the ocean?
When you talk about ocean warming and ocean acidification, if you're talking about extinction or biodiversity loss, I don't think 2050 is really going to be soon enough to see. I think by 2050 we will be able to name several species that are either incredibly harmed or maybe gone because of acidification, but it'll be a couple, and you probably won't. They won't be very. They'll be maybe a little obscure. I don't think we're going to see the biggest effects, and I hope. I hope I'm not wrong about this, but I don't think we're going to see the biggest effects by 2050. I think by the end of the century, we're going to start seeing a lot of acidification, and that's going to affect anything with a shell. It's going to, but when you affect things with shells, you're going to affect whole systems. But the question is, by then, will we even notice? Because the system will be so impacted by fishing habits. So I think it's an important question, but the changes will happen slowly, whereas the changes from fishing habits happen quickly. So will we even be able to spot them as average people? Not as scientists will know, but will the average person see the difference? I don't know the answer to that.
Do you know, I just haven't read about this particular angle. I just have a question. Maybe you can shed some light on my question. Wouldn't zooplankton certainly be a victim of ocean acidification. Don't zooplankton have shells on some level? That would be not shells in the form of conch shells, but you know what I'm saying. Do you?
Anything. I mean, yes, some zooplankton do. Plankton obviously is a very broad term that applies to from everything from bacteria to or protozoa up through arthropods. So it's not really a taxonomic group. It's a sort of a description of what they're doing.
Krill, maybe krill is what I'm...
Krill is also kind of a catch-all term. People use it for a couple different species, but it's actually more of a catch-all term for stuff that's a certain size float, hanging out in a certain place in the ocean. But you're right. Anything with calcium carbonate in its body and or shell is going to be affected by acidification, and what it's going to end up in the beginning, and I think in the next, by 2050, what you're going to see is thinning of shells. You're going to see, fewer animals because, they're not able to find as much material to make the shell, and the shell will be, they'll be more likely to be eaten by something else. So I think you're going to, but this is just starting. Like, acidification is really... We don't know as much about it. I actually haven't written very much about it because the science is still so new. It's very hard to write in a concrete way about it but there's no question it's going to happen. And the thing about the ocean, unlike the atmosphere, is it's kind of unstoppable. Changes in acidification and heat, they're slower, but they don't fluctuate as much. So when the ocean changes a little bit, it's much more permanent than when the sky, when the atmosphere.
Well, yes, it's going to be harder to turn around.
Yeah, you don't turn that around.
I mean, overfishing, you just get the boats out of the ocean, and you could theoretically turn overfishing around, but I don't see how we're going to turn this one around. And also, I guess the related one where we don't have to talk about 2050 as far as the coral reefs are concerned. We simply need to go down to the biggest coral reef on the planet and look around. What is your prognosis for coral reefs over the next few decades?
Well, coral reefs are actually really interesting. So, if you want to talk about Caribbean coral reefs, it's a disaster. But if you actually look at sort of, coral reefs that are sort of South Pacific, sort of, going towards India, sort of going under, the coral reefs sort of go, let's just say from, more or less Hawaii down to, India and New Zealand, those have actually come back to some extent. So coral reefs vary from one region to the next because the structure of how they're set up can be vastly different. And we're not exactly sure yet why that has happened. Some people have proposed that sponges are different playing a different role in the Caribbean than they are down in other parts of the world. But I think coral reefs are one of those where human action, like motivating human action, could go a long way preserving at least the structure of like what you think of a coral reef and animals that are swimming around it and like what we like about it. I mean, climate change is going to be playing some havoc on coral reefs regardless, but I do think we're starting to see sort of bleaching, reversing in some places. And I think that human activities could, by 2050, I think that's one thing we could turn around if we really got behind something. I do think coral reefs are resilient, and it's been hard to figure out, how to do it. What's the pressure point? Now in the Caribbean, I think it's not looking good. So, if your favorite vacation spot is, Cancun, or you want to go down to, Jamaica or something like that, I mean, it's not looking good, even Cuba.
Oh, St. Croix is gone. I spent a lot of time in St. Croix. I haven't even been there since this last hurricane, but St. Croix, that reef was gone years ago. Have you been down
there is reason to think, though, that there's hope in other parts of the world.
Have you been down to the big guy, to the Great Barrier Reef off of Australia? Have you personally been diving down there to bring us a first-hand report?
I haven't. When I went down there, I actually went to the other side of Australia and checked out the great white sharks for a story with National Geographic. One thing I should actually update on your description, I've actually published those stories with National Geographic already, and the one with Harper, those sort of outdated. So one of those stories I did was on great white sharks. I didn't get to the Great Barrier Reef, but the Great Barrier Reef is definitely one that, if you want to get bummed out, that's not been a success story yet. And I think some indications from other parts of the world tell me that there's possibility for hope, but I would not look at the Great Barrier Reef right now for hope. I think, sort of the South, I think there's the South Pacific and going towards, India is where you look for hope in that kind of area. But no, yeah, it's, and they're not going to be the same. I mean, some of the coral reef communities that we've seen in the past may not really come back. But they are resilient. And everyone around the world has been trying to figure out how to do replanting, how to replant coral reefs in an area. And it's really interesting. It hasn't worked. I'll say that right now. Like, a lot of countries, the United States, Colombia, Mexico's done a little bit of this. Israel has done a fair amount of this. And probably any country now with coral in their backyard has tried to figure out how to replant them. And we just haven't found the recipe to, like, putting in a few plants like you do with trees, and then they just take over and they come back, like with staghorn coral or something like that. But I still believe it's out there. I still believe with all the people working on it, we're going to figure out how to make coral, how to help coral replace itself. So we've only been doing it for a few years. So, it's just different. Everything's different underwater because we don't live underwater. You take it for granted. We're not, a Little Mermaid or something like that. If we lived underwater, we would know how to operate underwater a lot better. We'd be seeing these changes every day. Working with a forest is easy for us as humans. Working with coral is harder because we don't live underwater, and seeing the changes is harder. I think if we lived underwater, we'd be freaking out right now, though.
If we lived in an octopus's garden,
exactly,
it would not quite be the Ringo Starr vision of an octopus's garden. Anyway, one thing we would probably see in an octopus's garden at this point is those single-use water bottles and plastic bags and whatnot. So let's go into this can of worms. One of the big topics of discussion looking ahead to this planet is plastic pollution, particularly as it's going to be affecting the oceans and especially marine animals, everything from sea turtles to marine mammals to seabirds. Give us your crystal ball on where this is all heading with the plastic pollution.
I'm trying to keep upbeat a little bit, but it's not a great topic to keep upbeat on. The plastics are terrible things to put in the water because they're lethal at almost every size. They sort of, you can choke on them, when they get down to sort of smaller sizes. They get into your bloodstream. They're toxic in all these different kinds of ways. And when I say you, I mean your underwater creatures, not so much us.
We don't know about that either.
It's like, it's like, plastics are kind of the the angry guy who comes in, punches you in the face, and then on the way out the door kicks the dog. They get you at every spot, and there's a lot of it out there, and even after it disappears, it's still sort of around. So plastics all over the planet are really. We're not using less plastics. We've come up with a lot of alternatives. We've come up with solutions to deal with the plastics problem. And National Geographic has a huge cover story and big push right now on plastics, but we're not doing it. we don't seem to be doing it. I think this is one of those things where, you maybe should call it a sociologist. And, because that's, this is, some of this stuff is not a technical problem. I think, I think that, there are some interesting technical solutions that we need to come up with for ocean, for fisheries collapse and overfishing. I think we've got a lot of the solutions we've got for plastic. Just the people, it's very cheap, it's easy, and it's also part of the fossil fuels industry, and that's a tough industry to go up against. We get this stuff out of the ground, and it's very, very hard, and I just don't see that changing.
So I know you certainly have heard just kind of like fisheries will collapse by 2050. The also oft repeated story of ocean collapses is I don't even know where this first came from, but I don't doubt it, that there will be as much plastic in the ocean by 2050 as there are fish. It's just surely by weight. Do you agree with that assumption?
Well, I like the spirit of it. The spirit of it is I think the way a lot of these scientists approach these things. I don't know that it's true for one reason, because what tends to happen in a lot of these communities is if you wipe out one species, you don't necessarily wipe out biomass. Something else moves in, but it's maybe not something you want. So like in the Sea of Cortez, a classic example is a lot of niches have been filled by jellyfish.
Okay, so take jellyfish.
Big balloon jellyfish.
So there will be jellyfish. Jellyfish are taking full advantage of the collapse. But it makes sense to me. I mean, with the fish going down and the plastic going up, I haven't studied it to the degree you have, but it seems to me like it's pretty self-evident that those two lines are going to cross sometime between now and 2050.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll say this. I think that there is more we can do. We can have a bigger impact in the ocean by focusing on overfishing, and if we could get overfishing under control, these animals, these things that we love, would be much more resilient to the problems posed by plastic. And that's what we need. We need our oceans to be resilient. We're putting under a lot of strain right now. And with a lot of this stuff, even including climate change won't wipe out any species. You could probably make that argument, but on Earth, by itself, it's not going to wipe out a species. It's just going to be the thing that pushes finally these species too far, and it becomes too much, and then they'll disappear. So if we can make them more resilient, and I think the way to do that is really through focusing on overfishing, because that's what's hammering these species. And if there wasn't quite so much overfishing, if there was more resiliency, I think you would see these very resilient. It's amazing in the Sea of Cortez how many baby fish there are. If we could just let them grow, these things will come back. And they would be resilient to that. But that's what we need. We need these things to be strong enough to be able to fend off the threats from plastic on their own. I think that's the way you think about it. But yeah, if the two keep going down, there's no question we're going to see that dynamic where ocean wide, there's going to be, I don't know if you could ever really calculate that accurately, but what you're saying is true. There will be lethal levels of plastic that at a certain point there won't be enough animals to be able to withstand the choking and the toxicity from degraded plastic. But if we can get those populations up, they will. And I think that's the spirit of what that study is trying to say.
Okay, let's do one more, and then I want to talk briefly about about whether we can still eat seafood. I'm looking at this article from right about a year ago. I'm not sure where this was written. It was titled, "In the Depths of the Oceans, Human Activities Are Beginning to Take Their Toll." And you're talking about, deep sea mining. And I think, hardly anybody has ever heard of this. Just tell us little bit what that article, just kind of summarize that article. What is deep sea mining and where is that going to go, and how is that going to play into the collapse of the oceans over the next few decades?
Well, the deep sea is actually it's a hard thing to know exactly when the deep sea starts. Is it 300 feet? Is it 1,000 feet? Basically, it's where things get pretty dark and pretty cold. Is the way, and that goes on for a long time. In some places, there's a lot more deep sea than there is not deep sea, i.e., not quite so cold and light. And what's interesting is that certainly there's not as much life down there as there is where there's light, but there's a tremendous amount, and it's not just along these sort of sulfur releases or these different sort of like underwater volcanoes and like that. There's life in a lot of different contexts that have figured out ways to get by, either from things that drop down from above, or from sort of making their metabolism very, 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 very slow. And it's the deep sea is a really interesting place. I mean, there's no wave movement. It's like completely still and black. I've never been there, but I've talked to a number of scientists who have, and it's very it's very sensitive to changes, because these everything that's there that lives there is designed, or has evolved to handle things very, very slowly in order to survive. And this is a very hostile environment, the most hostile environment on Earth.
And it's getting ready to get more hostile.
And so humans have found valuable things down there, like as we do. We found, and some of it is in the form of literally rocks on the ocean floor just sitting there. And you imagine these giant fields of stones that are, football to golf ball size, just littering the floor, and they have precious metals in them. They have a lot of, I think cobalt is one of them, but you also get silver and some gold and a bunch of different things. A lot of magnesium, I think, is another one. There's a lot of different things that you can find on there. So if you can get any way of scooping these things up, it hasn't proven to be a moneymaker yet, but there's a lot of people trying to figure out how to make money off of that, or going down an underwater mountain and sort of scraping off the side and pulling out, minerals that we can use from that. Again, you're seeing a lot of efforts to figure out how to make this work
well, they're not
financially.
They're not going to send scuba divers down there.
No.
Just individually, very carefully picking up my vision of this is mountaintop removal.
Yeah, this is more in the area of giant bulldozers. Maybe some form of vacuum cleaner would be, another way to do this. These are things that are, have a pretty big impact on the environment down there, and we haven't even gotten close to categorizing the animals that live down there. So it's very possible we could send animals extinct that we haven't discovered. It's very possible we're doing that right now. In small areas where this is happening, there might be something really regionally based, and it could go extinct before we even find it. But this is an area that over the next, between now and 2050, I think we're going to see a very different approach to deep water mining. Now that this in this family, at a much shallower depth than what I'm talking about, there's also deep sea drilling, and it seems very deep to us on the surface, but compared to some of these other, really deep parts of the ocean, it's relatively shallow, but, you still have a different ecosystem that's being affected by deep sea drilling, and we don't really know much about it, and the laws around these things are not, and that's the biggest problem with that, is there's not really any laws around deep sea environments that would help protect them, and even figure out what the damage is. And that's what concerns me, is if there's damage happening, this is going to be another one of those, we didn't know it, 50 years later, once it's all gone, we didn't know it.
Oops.
So it's very hard to track what's going on when you pull off the side of an underwater mountain. there could be effects that last for hundreds or thousands of years in terms of these sort of big plumes, because things happen so slowly underwater. You can have these big plumes of silt and detritus sort of moving across an entire ocean, that takes hundreds of years to do it, and and nothing is adapted to handle that. I mean, things happen so slowly down there. It's unlike anything you can really imagine, except maybe in outer space.
Yeah. Now, I think they've already cranked the first one of these up off of New Guinea. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's going right now as we're talking? Are the underwater bulldozers down there?
It's been hard to figure out exactly what's going on. They've certainly been shipping out heavy machinery, and they have a permit to do it. A lot of this is taking advantage of small corrupt governments that need the cash, and I think that's what we're going to see for a while. We're going to see that happening, and then once someone figures out how to make money off this in a bigger way, it'll be everywhere. It'll be like fracking. Fracking happened in sort of the same way, in small experimental areas, which can be really really useful for like geothermal energy and things like that. But then once you figure it out, you start seeing it everywhere. That's what I worry about, is that we'll figure it out and then it'll be everywhere, and we won't know what we're losing.
Okay, one more that I just put, that just occurred. There's probably 20 more on this list. Let's talk about something we can see right now. We don't have to wait till 2050. Talk a little bit about this concept of ocean dead zones. What is an ocean dead zone? How many are there? And are there going to be a lot more 30 years from now than there are now?
Yeah, this is something that people have been studying for a while. I think the one you're probably referring to is in the Gulf of Mexico, the famous one.
Well, that's the most famous, but the one they're talking about a lot now, I think, is in the Arabian Sea. Some huge one that's actually been making it into the mainstream media. But they're all over. They
are. It's sort of. It's kind of what it sounds like. It's these large swaths of ocean that just see, and sometimes it's seasonal, where you see this really seasonal collapse in everything that lives there, and it's often I think the latest I've heard is that it was related to runoff from I think in the Gulf of Mexico. It's related to runoff from the Mississippi, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what these things are and how they operate. And they seem to be spreading to other places. The scientists I've talked about this, and I think that we're really scrambling to figure out what's going on here, think that this might be another one of those sort of straw that broke the camel's back kind of situations where, it's like what you see with bees, where these colony collapse disorders, which it turns out may not be a thing. It's just a combination of things. And, and they're just, I talked about resiliency earlier. I think this is a great example of why we need resiliency in the ecosystem, because, and this is not this is probably my least comfortable area of talking about the dead zones. But I've sort of read, about as much about them as you have. It's something I'm worried about. I just haven't. I think the science is still coming together, but I think that the smart folks I've talked about this have talked about, this need for resiliency and for the ability to have a population of shrimp or of guitarfish or whatever that's able to resist the influx of toxins or the loss of light, or a lot of this can be just from silt in the water that takes away light, and to be able to ride out that storm. And our ocean populations just aren't resilient enough to ride out these storms. That's the way I've heard it characterized. But what are your thoughts on it?
Do you agree with that assessment?
What's that?
Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I do. I think that the biggest thing that we can be talking about saving our oceans is to be talking about resiliency. We have to be building resiliency. It's the same thing as with a kid, trying to fight off diseases or something like that. I mean, these animals need a fighting chance. Mm-hmm. These are incredibly amazing animals because they live in 3 dimensions. It's very hard to make a species underwater go extinct, a pelagic species, open ocean species. Very hard to get every last one of them. And as a result, they're very resilient. But they've lost, hammerhead sharks. They've lost so many, 95% of their population. They've lost any resiliency. Yeah. And so if you want to see hammerhead sharks, you want your grandchildren to see them, we need to give them a fighting chance. And they will fight. They'll fight back. And get their populations up, and and they'll make it work. They'll figure out new migration routes.
If we just give them a chance, if humans just get out of there,
right? To build their populations back up, and you see this. The greatest example, again, going back to Chief Cortez, where I'm comfortable talking. Cabo Pulmo is this resort area, which it's been talked about a lot. It's this area basically where a bunch of fishermen decided we're going to leave this chunk of coast alone. It's a very, very small area for 15 years, and we're not going to fish there. They actually fished elsewhere, so it's not like they completely stopped fishing. But they left this one place alone, and it's sort of this. You basically saw the animals there quadruple over the course of 50 years. They just came back, and you go outside of that, they're still not there. But if you give them a chance, these many of the species we know and love come roaring back. And so that's what drives me insane about this is these animals, they're not shrinking violets. They're not going to they don't necessarily need life support. They just need a fighting chance, and they will come back. And and you'll give your grandchildren an ocean they can be proud of, they can really enjoy. And so but that's the thing that I think ties these together. When you talk about plastics, well, plastics wouldn't be a problem for a healthy ocean. A lot of animals would be able to resist this if they had, if it was, if there were more species. And when you think about, once again, getting back to my favorite topic of overfishing, a lot of the fish that die in overfishing, we're not eating. 80% in some cases, 90% in really bad cases, we're just chucking them overboard, looking for the stuff we want to eat. It's called bycatch. So it's not like we're eating our way into a loss of resilience. It's we're sucking it out of the way while looking for stuff we do want to eat.
Well, let's. Oh, good Lord, we have about 5 minutes left here. So, as I mentioned before we started talking, I just don't eat. I stopped eating seafood 8 years ago. I just said I can't take the guilt anymore. I'm done. I'm just done with eating seafood, and I love seafood. So, is your advice to stop eating seafood?
I wouldn't begrudge that decision. I mean, I wouldn't, and that's certainly one way to, but I think a more powerful message. The interesting thing about seafood is different from chicken and from beef and a lot of the things we eat, is that a lot of it we eat in restaurants. And, much more, when you look at the seafood that's being eaten, a lot more of it's being eaten in restaurants. Restaurants are extremely competitive. This is not some, monolithic, company that's basically, you're gonna eat chicken, regardless. These are competitive restaurants that can go out of business at a moment's notice. So that gives us a lot of power to be able to say, to be able to focus on sustainable seafood and say, do you have sustainable seafood? If you don't, I'm not going to come back here. And that means
what is your definition of sustainable seafood?
That's what we need. That's what we need. I have my definition, and it's pretty hardcore. And some people will say, well, maybe just slightly less, bycatch, or slightly less than other, people. There's a definition for organic food. There's not one for sustainable seafood.
Do you have a definition for sustainable seafood? Have you worked one out?
Well, I think the Monterey Bay Aquarium has Seafood Watch. They have this sort of guide that gives you green, yellow, and red fish, and it's a great, sort of like sometimes always never kind of a thing. And but the thing is a lot of companies will lie about, oh yeah, we got this halibut from Alaska, and it's super sustainable. I mean, Alaska does a great job of managing its underwater resources. And so everyone will say, oh yeah, this salmon's from Alaska because they do such a great job, but there's nothing stopping people from lying about it. So what we need is a definition sort of, guided by this that the Monterey Bay Aquarium uses, and I think they're a great resource, and then some sort of enforcement. It's too hard for consumers. As a consumer, you can get the Monterey Bay Aquarium Guide and use it, and that's great. But we do need, it's too hard to keep up with all the changes. We need an agency that can say, look, this is all we do is making sure that these populations are healthy, and there have been some attempts to do that, but they've all been woefully inadequate. So that's the biggest thing I think we need is we need something with teeth saying, look, you can't just toss this on the market and say this is sustainable. You need to actually be making steps, and this gets in and this gets out. And I think we don't. There's a lot of people working on this problem, but we haven't really got the key stamp, the key label that I feel like would do that. But what you can do is you can go into a restaurant and you can ask someone, even if you don't want to be this crusading person, you can just ask them, hey, is your fish sustainable? Even if I don't want fish. And they say, oh no, I don't. We just get it from Trident or whatever. And you say, well, look, I'll get the chicken today, but it's important.
Well,
what's that? It's important to me to have sustainable fish, and that has a huge effect on the restaurant and their choices going forward. Yeah. Just saying that can make a huge effect.
I see and this really has to be the last thing we can talk about before the camera shuts down. Your last thing on your list under Mix It Up, about 60% of the fish or seafood we eat in the U.S. is either shrimp, salmon, or tuna. Even if we hunted them right, no species can withstand being America's favorite fish. So just avoiding the top three, shrimp, salmon, or tuna, is a help. So you are telling people shrimp, salmon, or tuna, back off.
I mean, I think that's a great, and it also opens up your mind to other options, and start at the bottom of the food chain. Don't eat the big predators. Try some herring that's done really well. And open up your mind to some different things. I think that goes a long way to a healthier ocean.
Is there any seafood, and I really need to know this before we say goodbye, is there any seafood other than jellyfish in the year 2018, looking ahead the next 30 years, that you can say, Sam, feel free to eat your heart out of this seafood? Is there one that's completely guilt-free?
Oh man, someone's gonna yell at me no matter what I say, but I'll give you mine too. Okay. I mean, I think Alaskan halibut is a pretty well managed population, and I gotta give it to the underdog and say that U.S. caught red snapper from the Gulf of Mexico has made an incredible comeback because of good management practices. So I'm going to say, Mexican snapper, we're still trying to get some smart policies there, but U.S. caught red snapper has been a real recent winner. If you want to eat anything out of the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, so I'm going to go find me some red snapper tonight because I have not put my mouth on a red snapper in
Louisiana or Texas red snapper.
Well, I'm going to be back in Texas next week, so I'm going to celebrate by having me some Gulf of Mexico red snapper. But anyway, Erik Vance, this camera is going to shut off in 1 minute, so I want to say thank you very much for taking an hour out of your busy schedule, and anyone who wants to dive into a lot of Erik Vance's writing. This is Erik, that's ERIKVANCE.com, and they can find a lot more from you. Is that true?
That's true, absolutely. And, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to talk about fish. And tell me, I'd love to hear if you don't agree with halibut or snapper, You know, tell me why. And tell me
believe me,
if
if we don't get any comments on Collapse Chronicles, I assure you on that other channel, you will hear from some, what I call eco-Nazis will give you some comments about their opinion of recommending to eat anything out of the Gulf of Mexico. But we really need to say goodbye, Eric.
Okay.
And we do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was great being on.
We'll see you.
Take care.
Bye.